Hello everyone, this is DJ.
This is Marco.
And Michał.
And this is CG Talks, the podcast where CG guys talk about CG. And today we have a nice topic. We're going into some shady departments of CG, so we're trying
kind
to...
of a nice departure from November.
Yeah.
Well,
we're trying to,
in a way,
trying to cover what is shading and how to nail it.
Yeah. I think maybe we can begin with like defining shading, I guess, as we see it. Like in my case, I guess. So obviously we're talking about shading within the 3D workflow, and so that basically means it's that part of the workflow when you slap a material on your mesh or several materials on your mesh, and each material is basically sort of an object that exists in your 3D DCC that that gives all of the information of the surface properties of the object you're assigning this material to. So materials will tell you how rough a surface is, how shiny a surface is, whether light scatters within a surface, and essentially you would call these, and so you call these material shaders in that regard.
Yeah, I think if you would relate this to a traditional art like 2D drawing, for example, this is kind of like similar, because if you think about shading,
in a way, yeah,
shading,
well, the thing
line
is,
art, for example, you apply shading, like kind of like
true,
balancing the light and shade there, but it's even more than that, right?
Yeah, because I guess in 2D shading encompasses not just describing like the surface property of something, right? Like if you were to paint something metallic, that that's part of the shading process, but then it also, you would call that, I suppose, also like how describing form, right? So like if a 2D artist would shade, and by shading like their outline, for example, will give a sense of form because they're also describing the interaction of an imaginary light source.
Yeah,
whereas
so
in
it's
3D,
like shading and lighting combined.
Yeah, exactly.
So
but
I would define the shading as, setting up how the given material reacts to light. Like what happens to light hitting this kind of material. It's bounced,
more
diffused, like there's subsurface scattering,
right,
any of this stuff,
or roughness.
What happens to light hitting these materials and how it reacts to it. And by the way, there's like two levels of thinking about shading in CG. I mean, calling shaders, because there's this distinction, like inside of this world, like texturing is just taking care, just part of shading, because it's the textures themselves, the maps.
Yeah, because
and
oftentimes you would plug textures into a shader, right? And
yes, exactly.
Those textures drive the inputs.
And shader would be what layman would call material in general, what kind of material it is, but we call it shader in CG. But also, there are two kinds of, when you say, okay, this is that shader, you can mean two things. And one thing is that shader is that exact setting of the material, like this kind of everything you set in the material. But other thing, for example, shader would be like this, for example, V-Ray has its shaders, and the most important is V-Ray material, but also we have V-Ray light material and other kind of models of shaders which have their own settings and properties which are possible to set, and these are also called shaders. Like so basically with V-Ray material shader, you can create unlimited number of shaders in that meaning of that exact material. So for example, if from a point of view of, let's say, some guy who is working in RenderMan in some huge studio and he's a coder, he's creating shaders, but not in terms of creating this specific material, but in terms of creating this kind of set of settings and behavior of some kind of material. So this is also
exposed parameters, you might say, right?
Yes, like writing the code of what this exact material setup is going to do, and how it's going to react to light or emit light, whatever, what's going to happen with light there. So this is also called a shader. Like Corona has its own shaders, V-Ray has its own shaders, but usually, I mean, I think everybody understands it. But in general, in the world of creators, it's used as a shader. It's used as this particular, let's say, this sample ball in your material editor, which creates the effect of this particular material.
Yeah, but right now in modern 3D DCCs, you kind of have this basic types of material shaders that you mentioned. Like, for example, for a specific render engine, you have these are kind of like a building blocks for you to really complete your shader setup, like your individual material that you're creating. You can mix them up. You can right now create like a huge node setups, mixing different shader types together and doing stuff like that, right? And then you have also in this area, you can also differentiate the surface level shaders and the volume shaders as well, because they can deal with how the surface reacts or how the whole volume of the mesh reacts to light, right?
Yeah. So what are shaders and how to nail them? So I think that this is one of the things that when you watch works of people in CG, you can assess their level of experience and skill, the shaders. And when I remember, this is a route of understanding the materials, and you need to kind of be able to take a material and like explode it to very simple parts of this material. So this is, I think, one of the first skills of looking at a complex material and being able to analyze it. I don't know how to call it, to split it into many small features of this material, which together give the end result. And one of them is, I think, this is what I learned on the way. One of the things is to really create good materials. So one of the things is that it's observation of nature, and it's not even observation of watching some photographs, which are of course are very helpful, and this is a reference for which helps you to understand. But really watching real physical objects. And at some point I just got it, like it was very much stressed on some CG forums when I talked, that everyone like from time to time somebody experienced would say, okay, cool, you have all these photos of this plastic or whatever, but really nothing will replace a real thing which you hold in your hand, and you can rotate it and watch what happens with light.
I think that's the biggest gotcha there, is that you could look at a series of photographs, but I mean, understandably, like you probably don't want to fill your room with like a bunch of rocks and twigs and bricks and whatever, but so inevitably you will. I mean, it really helps to go out there and like sometimes what I used to do was like use the light of my mobile phone, go somewhere dark, use the flashlight on my mobile phone and shine it on the object, and kind of and then rotate it in my hand, and then after I take pictures, so that you can later on come back. But see, like you if you take the picture yourself, you sort of also know like what kind of pictures you need to take, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this is what this looks like in an even diffuse scenario. This is what this looks like with one hot source of light. This
Mm-hmm.
is what it
And
would
that
look like.
and
Yeah.
that's also the thing with photos, that you're looking at a specific angle, viewing angle, specific lighting situation that the material is set in, and that's the whole problem with with also texturing for shading. Because one thing is understanding how the nature works in its own natural environment, and that's one part of understanding the shaders. But the other side of it is understanding what happens in a 3D, like the artificial environment, what needs to happen to recreate that situation. Because in fact you are kind of like decomposing the material to like its basic elements that you mentioned, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the diffuse, the albedo, the all the surface imperfections, normals, right? So kind of roughness of the material, and then you, in the 3D scene, you will relight it, sort of. So you have to kind of like decompose all the things that happen in nature, split it into it's like with the albedo, for example. It doesn't really, it's not very easy to see that in the real life, because in real life you never have like this no shade, super overcast situation that where there's no reflections really. So this information you always get in nature, but in a 3D environment, in this artificial virtual space, you have to kind of like build it from scratch, like from from the basic information about the color, then about the roughness, how it behaves with this artificial lights you put in. So it's kind of like decomposing nature to reconstruct it in an artificial environment. So it's kind of like also takes a part of understanding what the 3D software does with the information that you provide to the shader.
That's true, yeah. Although, I mean, I think that it should be said, I mean, especially if like people listening are like new, to shading in general. Don't be discouraged, because yeah, this is all true, and this is all good to know. But these days, I mean, you can get away with basically knowing how to plug a texture set into some Uber shader on your DCs. Because like we were talking earlier about texturing and how that's not necessarily part of shading, but it kind of is, because textures do drive the shaders, and you can actually replicate, like you can find many surfaces that have all of the maps that will drive these parameters
and
for you.
These pre-built Uber shaders, as you call them, they can be kind of like a good roadmap for learning the things about shading, because they provide you with some exposed things. Like you provide them with the specific maps, and these maps can give you quite a nice indication on what types of surfaces there are, because most of the types of things that are in the real world are really covered in these shaders, right? So you can kind of expect what needs to be provided, right? What kind of values you have to look for in a material to achieve the effect that you're looking for.
Yeah, so nailing the shaders would mean, I think it would mean, so one thing, understanding some of the features like Fresnel, right? Fresnel reflection, which this is one of the first things you need to learn, and the general rules and physical rules and theory behind materials. Observation, which, by the way, at some point I just used any kind of occasion to observe materials. Like, I was not very confident about this Fresnel thing, because there was not a lot of material. I mean, there was a lot of information about Fresnel when it comes to refraction and some completely useless materials. Like there were tables like for diamond, ruby, and stuff like that.
It's unusable unless you're a jewelry designer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I would use every kind of occasion to learn. Like, for example, waiting for a bus on a bus station, or when I was in a bus, I would just look. Okay, I have some aluminium, some painted steel with some plastic, some leather, like on my seat. And I would try to look at it under, like from various angles, and observe it, the level where people in the in the bus would think that there's something wrong with me. I'm high or something like that. So that's a good thing. Like you can learn just every moment in your life just by paying attention to what's around you and how it's behaving, and looking on various angles to kind of, like you have, like, let's say 10 photos, and these are, let's say, case studies or just these specific cases, but you need to extract the general rule which stands behind these all specific situations, because in reality all these effects, all these photos, let's say of a, I don't know, a ceramic mug or anything, they come from the same set of rules, and you need to be able to extract these rules from these specific situations to put them into the shader settings, which anyway leads to another thing, which this is like never ending discussion in CG among artists. Should you create shader like universal shaders, or should you tweak them or set them for this particular scene and particular lighting? Which I think this is something in between. Like, you it's not like one of the first things that you may, when you are starting with CG, is that when you take some shader you download, for example, there were V-Ray shaders, V-Ray-shaders.de. There was like a German, I think, website for not only for textures but for the full shaders. I don't know if it's out there anymore. And people would download the shader. They could see the sample render, and they would put it to their scene, and it looked different. And so basically, it's not like you have like this universal shader which will look good in every kind of lighting and setting without tweaking it. So that's another thing.
It also it's very it has to be very case to case, and it will depend on your lighting scenario also. Which I guess is also why it's very important to see, to get to sort of build a visual library of different surface types and how they might react under like extremely different lighting scenarios.
And that only just falls into the category when you're trying to do a kind of photorealistic render. That's one thing with the shader that you can do with the shaders, but then there's the whole wide world of the creative shader use, like we've seen in November, for example, which was like, for the most part, a shader thing, right? Like people were doing crazy things with just the shader part of the 3D environment, right? Using vector displacements. So you can really, using displacements, for example, you can even kind of like model with shaders, right? These are in fact just like algorithms in software, right? They are capable of doing like all sort of stuff that computers do. And I think, like, the NPR thing, the non-photorealistic renders, we can talk about that like maybe later on in this episode as well, because it's also an interesting thing that you can, mix this together, use this creatively for your advantage as a 3D artist. Like, you don't always aim for the photorealistic render, but you always aim for a good render, right?
Yeah. No, but I'd argue even that, like, even if you're trying to achieve a level of photorealism, I mean, like if you're trying to, actually, I'm not even sure that, like, I was going to say that, for example, a lot of AAA games, obviously, like, try to strive towards a certain degree of photorealism, but I mean, I think that in general, it might not be the case for every industry, but generally, like, if you're just thinking about like 3D art, like I found that like striving for, like, you can like really celebrate, like the capabilities of 3D programs to really kind of like depict crispy, surfaces that remind you of the real thing, but you also have to understand that they never will be the real thing, and that to a certain extent it is important to kind of understand how you can stylize the surface. So
Mhm.
like a frayed piece of cloth, for like there are many things that you can do on a surface that will that like that would kind of fall in the rendering for photorealism camp, but really they're not, like it like there are always going to be like these exaggerations and these extra elements added
Mhm.
in just to
Mhm.
sell the feeling of something,
Yeah.
sell the feeling of a surface, and not
Yeah, it's kind of like
really
with the
try to replicate it one to one.
kind of like with the advertising photography. When you make shoot the food that have to look more tasty than the real food, or
Yeah.
sometimes you have to do tricks.
Yeah.
But then again, you have this approach, as for example the Ikea catalog has. The team behind it. I've watched some kind of documentary on how they did it, and this there was like kind of a big cooperation between photographers team, and they were kind of like very almost scientifically scanning the materials, testing their photo capabilities of the real materials,
Mhm.
and they were trying to recreate that in V-Ray shaders. I think that they were using V-Ray for that, and they built like really, really, almost like scientific building of photorealistic representations of the products and materials, and they were really nailing it, right? So most
Mhm.
people aren't like laymen; they can't really tell that the photos in the catalog, there are so much of it is CG right now. It's kind of like indistinguishable from a photography.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So
finally,
it's achievable, right?
It
when,
is
when,
achievable, yeah. But
when you,
generally, I mean, unless you're trying to like, maybe if you're working in VFX, but even that is kind of arguable. But also if you're like trying to do visualization for product, then maybe you really need to get to go that deep. But uh yeah, in most
But
cases,
whatever
yeah,
you're aiming for is good to understand like the basics of it, and how far
for
you want to
sure.
go. You can go
Mm,
with understanding the science behind it. Like I've seen
yeah.
quite a nice
Yeah.
introduction by, I think, by Blender Guru for that. When he was explaining the metallic and non-metallic surfaces,
yeah.
and
Mhm.
just like the
Yeah.
basics, you have to get a grip on that first. That the materials really fall into a certain amount
Yeah.
of categories.
Yeah. Oh,
Actually,
I guess what I'm
his video affected the way I'm thinking about, because I learned, the shading from with V-Ray, and V-Ray gives you some specific model of settings, all of the settings. So at some point you start thinking that this is how the material, these are the elements from which the material is put together, because it was the first, let's say, a model of a photorealistic material I dealt with, this very MTL material. And I watched the Blender Guru video about Fresnel and how he created actually these shaders in Cycles, because as far as I remember, Cycles didn't have this feature then as default. And I learned a lot of stuff which I thought that I was learning from other users of V-Ray. And then he actually explained some of the stuff about the metallic surfaces, like that they don't have the diffuse color, which sounded very logical, and also it was backed by some very simple but uh, scientific explanation what the diffuse color is. And you could say that the steel have a diffuse color of gray and stuff like that, but there was some better explanation of what diffuse is. It's not just not non-reflective, non-glossy reflective reflection of the light, but actually the diffuse is a color of material which is in a way on some very this very external layer of the material. It's like a little subsurface scattering, and he explained it like that. I've never had the chance to or time to check on it deeper, because it was very interesting for me. Like, I really like to understand the rules, how they are. I don't
The
like
physics.
this. Yeah, I mean, I really like to make it, do it proper, do it right. And but it was very interesting. Actually, it changed the way I continued to do shaders. It was simplifying it and making that all theory, or just the idea of setting up a shader more elegant. Like it was more closer to the real thing. And there were a lot of myths around setting some kind of shaders, like in V-Ray community for a very long time. And actually, this video proved me that some of these myths were wrong. So yeah, that's also that thing, which is not easy to find, the rules of physics and the general rules of creating materials. Because one is observation, that would be observation to nail it. Second, it would be knowing how the physics works. And you might be kind of like repelled by that. Well, I don't want to learn physics because I'm artist, but this is that part of the physics which you don't really need to know a lot of numbers, or you don't need to know equations so much. Just understand the rules in the same way as, I don't know, some painters from 19th century understood from the real life. So that would be knowing the physics and the rules. The third would be knowing
I think just to
properties.
maybe more specifically, I'd say optics. Yeah, like not
Yeah,
physics
exactly.
in general, but optics.
Yeah, optics.
That particular branch.
And we don't
Yeah.
mean
Really
mean these denoiser algorithm.
Yeah,
We
not
mean
not
optics
that.
as the
Yeah,
part of
so-
Optics
science.
with an X, but
So-
with a
so
C.
the-
yes.
So the third thing would be knowing your shaders in your render engine, because they have some set of settings, and you need to also know them. Just know your tool, because this is the tool of creating this kind of these materials.
Yeah, this can be tricky sometimes, if you don't know these things. Like, for example, if you provide maps for a specific shader, they can expect some type of data. For example, like people first time using cycles, for example, might not know that if you plug in a normal map, for example, you have to set it to non-color data. So because this is it's not about the colors of the map, it's about the information that's there. That's not really relevant to color. It's a different type of data, or you have to set up gamma differently. For example, I was using Luxor lately, and there was like, if you plug in a map that's providing height information, so just like a black and white, you have to set up gamma differently for this kind of map, and that's also sometimes the case. So you have to pull how it deals with certain types of input data.
Yeah,
like a map, for example.
And another thing I would say is understanding the distinction between photorealistic and let's say plastic good effect. Like the photorealism is underneath this good effect, but a lot of materials in real life, they look really crappy, and you want to basically. I recently, this is what I understood in creating materials. Of course, it's good to play around with it, and you don't have to be like a perfect. This is like a road of learning, but it's very good to you have these tools of creating these particular materials. So, for example, like in one of these tutorials we were working with, which is going to be showed soon, based on a computer game. At some point, I knew that I want a frost on a plastic material, and so that I kept that in mind, that this is what I want. And then I was setting all the settings and playing around with them until I achieved something that I was satisfied with, this kind of look. So basically, you need this kind of look, it, and you learn it on the way as you are more and more experienced, and of course you have some talent to that. And finally, you use all these tools to get this kind of look of material. So, for example, one of the things that I started to do very quickly was like I was doing some interior visualization, and I was doing some bathrooms. And so there were these bathtubs where you like shower bathtubs, these glass boxes where you enter and you take a shower. So basically, it's all made with glass. And if you put there a physically correct Fresnel IOR number, then which is like 1.61 or something like that, on 1.6 51, I remember. There's basically one number for that, for all the glass. Maybe there are some glasses which have a little different one, but so you can make it. But so when you put it there, very often the glass doesn't look well because the reflection and refractions, and especially reflections, depend not only on the feature of your material, of the reflective features, but also on the environment which is going to be reflected in this material. So this is also another very often made mistake by people who start with CG. Well, why I don't have cool reflections on my car? Well, because there's nothing around to be reflected. So you need to, like take like some HDRI map or whatever. So at some point I noticed, Jesus, in most cases this glass is completely transparent. I cannot see that there is that thing there. It looks crappy. It's not giving enough of information that this is the glass box for taking showers. So rather than using IRR, which gives me just one effect, I would go to the reflection channel of this map, put there a fall-off map, which is in general you can set it to change the value of the reflection based on the angle, and I would just like tweak and play around with those settings as long as I get the reflections I wanted on this element, which look cool. And they were not physically correct, at least when it comes to the number of IOR and stuff like that. But for my eye, that was still glass. But at least it was real glass. I could see this element in my scene. It was not completely like refractive or something like that. It was more glassy than real glass in this particular lighting conditions. Like probably there would be some other situations when just the taking this value from Wikipedia or whatever and putting there would be enough. But then you have to sometimes kind of pump it up,
because sometimes there's the slight difference between photorealistic and good looking, right? So you have to balance it out. And one thing that came into my mind in the situation, like we probably faced the camera towards the glass and you were doing like this kind of render straight up front. So one thing that you could do is like placing a light some kind of a light in a specific place so that it would reflect in the glass somehow for that specific camera angle, right? Because this is also camera angle independent. Or you could also try doing like making this glass not super clean, right? Not just like the glass material, but you could make it, add some surface imperfections like condensing water on this, and then it will provide some kind of like a illusion of reality and interaction with light, right? Just those micro imperfections that can provide this level of realism or feeling of the material.
In terms of not existing lights, only from reflections, this is like studio lighting. This is just,
that's one thing that we came about when we were talking on one live stream with Mateusz Wielgus, I think. He said like he was doing like photoreal ArcViz, and then he sometimes used like tricks in boosting up elements of the scene, placing some fake lights, kind of like making a setup, for a photo shoot and adding that extra photography, reflectors just adding that little light.
Or the rim lights, like exactly, impossible to have come from, right?
Like photography, for example, if you do like photography of human beings in the outer, in the outsides, like if you see photographers doing model photo shoots, they always, tend to have those, reflection planes or some kind of like lighting equipment to make this, balance out the natural shadows, lights, especially.
I talked with some cinematographer, and he was, I was talking to him many times, and every time he was talking about something different because it was like learning and he was paying attention to different stuff. But at some point it said there's no lighting without flags or without shading, without, these black screens taking the light. So there is some contrast, and you can, then the lighting is visible better. And exactly, there are those black screens to screen the lighting. There are these reflective. You can even take like a polyester big like a block and use it to reflect the light, or I mean in reality, or you can just take some aluminum foil like this, you can buy it in the store with kitchen stuff, and you can use it, you can glue it to some board and you can use it. So yeah, so this is even
that's another difference between real life situations when you observe the materials, when you have kind of like an experience of the whole 3D space around you and the real environment that you're dealing with, and then when you're doing CG art, it's a little bit like photography, because you're kind of like cutting out a piece of this. So you're creating an image, and that's a whole different story. And just like that's why the photorealistic photos that you take with your cell phone, for example, sometimes they can be a lot of crappy images, right? Because you're just and they are photorealistic, right? They are captured from reality with a machine, nothing special involved. Like they are photoreal, but they are not looking good, right? And sometimes sometimes they even tend to look like this is not right, looking real. In the photo, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And
I think one interesting going back to shading, I mean, I guess it's it's a matter of cutting things out, in that to some extent the information that you're conveying is like an approximation at best, but you do it in a aesthetically pleasing way. But then you can also add on to it. Like, I think one really interesting trick I think I picked up from Magdalena Dudella, a texture artist. And by the just a quick a thing for, like, if you use texturing software like Mixer or Substance.
By the way, a new mixer just came out.
Yeah. I haven't really been able to
smart
you mean
materials.
Quixel Mixer?
Yeah.
Mixer.
I think like the 2020 release had the smart materials, and then there's this new one, right, that came out just recently.
A new set of pre-made.
Oh, new set. Oh, wow, man. Yeah, like I haven't seen that yet, but no. Anyway, basically, where were we? Shady. Like adding on to sort of the stylistics that can go into it. So this texturing software, when you work in it, essentially what you're doing is like or when you're texturing 3D in general, you're working with you're painting all of these different maps for all of these different surface parameters. So in a way, you could say that as you're previewing the work that you're doing in a texturing application, you're looking at it as shown by a shader. Like, you have a layer, and in that layer that layer contains all of the channels that you need to see, and all of those channels are being like, the visual feedback you're getting is a summation of like all of these different channels working together to create the surface that you're trying to make, right? So anyway, so she was texturing like this head, this like it was some kind of orc thing, some creature. Obviously those don't exist, but one yes, sorry.
Yeah,
no, I might be wrong. I might be wrong.
Yeah, but they are
not in my
inspired.
backyard, but who knows? Yeah, I mean,
so you claim.
So I claim. No, but
Let's
so
agree to disagree.
yeah, but so anyway,
you mean orcs don't exist, but reptilians? Come on.
Yeah, maybe. No, but yeah. So back to the so like but the skin, what she did with the skin was interesting, because so what she did was so she she set it up the way you would expect the skin to behave, more or less like the surface of the skin. But one of the nice touches she did was she used the ambient occlusion map. And so an ambient occlusion is basically where you might get shadowing in all of the ridges and creases in a particular surface. And this is, you'd hardly see this like on a face, like at any at any point, really, unless it's like, unless the face is particularly wrinkly and you have like high contrast lighting. But what she did was she took this map. So basically, wherever there's a crease or a a depression on the surface, like the map has black on it, let's say, and she used this map as a mask to drive an additional red color over the subsurface scattering map. And so you have like the light scattering on the skin, and then you have this but you have this additional layer that just adds this nice touch of red, like it gives you the illusion of there being blood underneath that skin.
Yeah, and that's logical that in these places usually the skin might be little more, like not so
thinner.
thick.
Yeah, thinner and more likely to which is actually
to reveal the blood.
Right, yeah.
And stuff like that.
Yeah, but
Wow,
nice.
nice.
it got to a point where even like even the creases around like the shit, what do you call those things, like labella at your like the pads of fat like around your nostrils on the nose, or like your nasolabial fold, like these uh your cheeks like branching out from your nose, like from close to your eyes, how this sort of fat branches like outward diagonally to form like the lower area of your cheek. Those are called like nasolabial folds because they fold around the nose and the lips. But even there, like you really, like if you were looking at something in real life, you wouldn't really see that, but it had like it had this effect that really like sold it felt like a living breathing thing. And a lot of it, in my opinion, had to do with that particular with those little like touches of I guess artistic license, which I thought was really cool. Yeah.
I mean, you use the rules of anatomy, physics as an excuse to do it some beautiful effect. And also, I was what you said was yeah. I mean, one of the very important parts of nailing shaders is to not give up on detail. And of course, and one thing is that you need to do it, but also you need to learn how to be aware of it. Like for example, she did that ambient occlusion in places where there might be some more flesh visible and blood through the skin, and this is some kind of observation and knowledge about the anatomy. You need to first notice it to actually
exaggerate it.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly, to even take it into consideration in your shading. So well-informed observation is important. Like watching some tutorials in physics, and anybody who has this level of understanding materials helps. Then you doing your own observation and experiments. By the way, at least in one studio where I worked, the normal workflow of creating shaders was to start creating it in the studio. So in a studio settings lighting. So we didn't put it right into the scene unless these were like bulletproof checked materials. But if you were trying to create something more new, we had a studio setting, and I would first had to create this shader in the studio lighting. This very simple studio, right? You can find on YouTube like V-Ray studio setup, and that was because to root out every kind of environment is going to influence the look of your materials, and sometimes the environment setup, the lights, the number of lights, the type of lights, the type of materials, the temperatures of your various light sources is so big that it can really confuse you and make it more difficult to create that material. This is all adding up to the look of your material, and at some point you cannot be really aware, okay, what part of this look comes from the material itself and what part is caused by the lighting and the environment conditions. So we would start by putting this material creating in very simple lighting conditions. Like of course that setting would be helping to see the reflection, the refraction, the roughness, all that stuff. Like, it wasn't very complicated setup. It was like one of these YouTube simple studio setups. But then if that looks good in these lighting conditions, like it's okay. Then I can put it in more complicated one, and I also remember the look of this material from the studio. So now I can see what's happening with this material. I can tweak it to look good. And also I noticed that this is something that I've never really went through that phase that at some point there's Fresnel reflection. So for example, like I was doing some ArcVis. So one of these were floors, right? You have the Fresnel reflection of the wood planks on the floor. And one of the things is that some stuff which you watch is very often the way it looks is very often not only affected by the physical properties of this material, but also it very often appears in a very specific lighting conditions, and every time these conditions are similar, so it can make you like you can get fooled by that. For example, when you look at the floor and you want to check the Fresnel reflection, very often you watch the floor towards you watch the floor towards the window, and now you can see some kind of like as it goes away, there's more and more reflection on the floor, which is the Fresnel, but also it's closer and closer to the window, and the window is visible in these reflections. So sometimes this is a problem of watching the stuff where the rules of the material mix with this particular lighting setup, and that can fool you. Like that floor thing was very, like, when I realized, okay, now I don't get Fresnel. I think I'm watching this stuff always in the very similar lighting situation, and that's kind of making me confused when I try to replicate it. Because if I would, for example, look on the floor standing in the point where the window is and look the opposite direction, then it looks different. Okay, I was always watching at the floors on this angle because it was like, the effect was the strongest, but also invisible, but also it was only one of many, but I was only looking at this kind of situation. It's hard for me to find other ones, but for example, when you take a metal ball, like a steel ball, you very rarely can look at it in, for example, in a very dark place where there's only a little lighting source, and you will see that it's black. It's not really having a lot of stuff to reflect. It's kind of like poor material. It looks poorly. When on the other hand, you will go out, or I don't know, you can find
because metallic things are that's all about reflections, and that brings me to the other example I would give for the shaders, and the thing that you have to observe things, and also it's good to be curious about the materials itself, like the physical properties of them or how they are made. And the example I wanted to give would be car paint shaders. This is a kind of tricky shader area, when sometimes people try to make cars and they just slap on a simple shader without the whole sophisticated nature of car paint, because specifically like car paints are designed to look very good on cars, and they implement some specific technologies to get that, like for example making the metallic flakes into the shader paint, into the real paint, and then covering with a super reflective base coat or stuff like that. Like, so they are kind of layered, layer after layer, because they reflect and make specific, I don't know, opalization on the edges, these kind of like effects that are specifically designed to make the car look perfect, right? Like make them look good. And it's also sometimes you're making a visualization, for example, of a car to make it awesome. You also place it in a very specific, designed environment, kind of like even unnatural ones. Like if you see the car commercials, for example, they are always kind of showing the cars in very strong, specific, locations, or if they're placed in nature, it's a really specifically, time of day, the lighting, the environment, the clouds or skyline, whatever. It's going to reflect it all, right? So it will make the car look good, or even if you just place it in a studio environment, it's always with some fancy lighting, just to showcase the lines of the car and the effects that the car paint makes. So it's really important to make the render of this kind of car look good. You have to understand how this specific car paint works, so that you can recreate it in a shader.
And it's what I want to say, you can see that material on steroids when you go to some mall and there are those little cars for kids or planes where they just sit and they just go up and down, and they usually are painted with this car with flakes paint, but it's like on steroids. It's like a candy
overdone.
Yeah. And one of the things is that, I mean, like once you analyze the stuff, and you need to find as much detail as it's possible and use it to your advantage. And one of the things is that you can map, of course, you can use maps to map the, let's say, the strength of the reflection, because there are some places on this material which are less reflective and there are some of which are more reflective, and you can use a map. But then you can use this map also for the how glossy is this reflection, and it's a little harder to understand. It's really harder to, like, for me it's easier to translate the strength of the reflection to the value of the settings in the material, and it's more difficult to translate the glossiness or how much soft it is. Like, if it's very, very reflective, or this is like a satin reflective, and actually it's kind of easy to do it when the whole material has the same settings. But when it has like various settings, like for example, let's say some pavement block very often has this. It's more difficult to really translate it to the numbers and then to use it as a map, where various places of the map are giving the different values of how soft or blurred reflection it is. So it's also one of the things that. But you need to study it and need to go into it and need to have an eye for it, because when you add it to your material, then they really start to like spark. This is when the people who, let's say, don't know the CG, they look at it and they say, wow, that looks really photorealistic, or that looks very cool and very professional, or whatever word they use. So
yeah, and one of the hardest things, I think, to nail with the shading is when you're going into more organic materials and you're dealing with the subsurface scattering. So that's kind of like easily confused with the normal translucency and stuff, and because this is a really subtle effect, and you can so easily overdo it or omit it, not doing it right, because it's hard to sometimes grasp. There are like the obvious conditions where you can really see the effect taking place, like when you place a lighting bulb in front of your hand, and then you see like very strong effect of the subsurface scattering on your hand. So you can really get this extreme effect and know that the phenomenon is really existing, but it's kind of like it's existing in so many places, but it's really, really subtle. So you have to really be careful with the values, and it's really hard to grasp to set this up correctly and not to make things look too waxy. Or
because
I think this is the thing that especially character artists are struggling with, for the realistic rendering of humans or food renders, for example.
And I know that you guys, when you created 3DB library, you had this aha moment where you figure out we need more subsurface scattering, wasn't it?
Yeah,
that way?
yeah. Initially we were trying to. Mm, actually, it was something that we had already considered a little bit in the beginning, but at the time, like we didn't really. It would have taken a lot of work on the development side to create the like to because a part of the like mainly it was supposed to be for 3ds max and the initial like highlight feature would have been like dragging the asset from the light from the app into the max viewport, and then if you're on V-Ray, it detects you're using V-Ray and it creates a correct shader network for all of these materials with the textures already linked to these
Mm-hmm.
to the shaders. So if we wanted to add scattering to the food scans, or translucency, then that meant that automation wise we would have to the the descriptor the app the max script should be able to generate the right like setup for either translucency or subsurface scattering,
Mm-hmm.
um depending on what was on the descriptor file. But then we like it was such a case to case basis that we would have
Mm-hmm.
to anyway it just it at the time like it just wasn't really feasible, like because there were other things that had to be done. And but then later on we realized that yeah, the food would like just wasn't really cutting it because it lacked that feeling of like freshness. The greens and the fruits like lacked this feeling of freshness. And finally we bumped up in the priority list, setting up the supporting volumetric translucency and subsurface scattering in the app itself, and how it read the assets when they were being imported. And I think it was a really good idea. Like thanks to Barbara, especially
Yeah.
who really worked on finding the right, like the perfect balance, like to get the right look. Um, and yeah, it's a
I
good thing.
noticed that.
Yeah,
I remember when you talked about it, and when you released the 3DB new models, like food models revisited, and
yeah,
wow, they look so good now.
yeah. It's just it was such a and we actually so we held a contest even like centered around the food theme, and people had to use like the food scans. And so we got to see some of them like lit in different ways, and you could really see the like where the translucency really shone. And to be honest, like that, like there are a lot of assets where just because of the limitations of the automation, I mean because like it's automated, so like you can't and it's being driven by maps to an extent, like the where you would find translucency and whatnot. But some stylization had to be made just so that uh you could have some areas and some bits of food that are like more complicated assemblies of food that were uh that like okay, this area really does have translucency, but then the areas around it shouldn't. But then by adding just a tiny bit of translucency to these areas as well, it really gives it this feeling of it can make something look so much creamier or so much
Mm-hmm.
more so yeah, it was a really uh
It,
nice to see.
the funny thing is that when you look at it, you would normally wouldn't even notice this element of the material, like
Yeah,
subsurface scattering. It's so subtle, but
but
when
you
you
would
add
feel it,
it,
right? Yeah,
yeah, you would add it, and your brain intuitively is reading it. I mean, it's somewhere there, but your
yeah,
brain is reading it at this kind of feature, which is
yeah,
this is one of the things which I think I watched some movie about it, like documentary. This is one of the things which we learn as kids, as children, and the whole life. we are learning to intuitively read the features of the material, to give us the information we need. This is something I can get a strong grip on or not, or this is some kind of slimy stuff, right?
Yeah. Or is
This
it
kind of is this
is it
fresh or not?
juicy? Like
Yeah,
if
exactly.
it's juicy, then
Playing
it's
with the
probably
food.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's
So
why
at some point,
kids do strange stuff with food.
yeah, I mean, and
Experimenting.
I guess
So-
that's
so-
why, like
yeah.
you like as it, like maybe that's why the like putting everything in your mouth is like as a kid, right? That's just something kids tend to do.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
wonder if it's because of the because there's still like that faculty of them being able to really like read surfaces and be
And don't
informed as to
they don't
whether-
have to analyze it. It's like the AI
Yeah.
learning by
Yeah.
experimentation. They like
Exactly.
would hit old stuff against other stuff, and they
Yeah.
would just basically sometimes by looking on the material you can say what sound it would give if you would like poke it with a stick, right? Because this
Yeah.
is already somewhere coded in your brain by all these experiments you did usually as a kid.
Right. Dang, that's wow, that's pretty cool.
Yes, so I was thinking that maybe because for the whole talk I was trying to organize it. So so how to nail the shaders, the observation, understanding the physics as much as you can, the optics, knowing your software, your material settings, the technical part, experimenting and experience and learning from guys who are better than you to learn the best, and I don't know, not
And,
giving
well,
up on detail.
Yeah, but also developing like learning to see the aesthetic value in something and knowing when you should push it and
Yeah.
when you should subdue it. But
Knowing what you
working
want to
within-
see, right?
Yeah, but working within the parameters of like what is physically like an approximation of real physical
Unless-
behavior.
Unless you want to consciously cross that divide,
Yeah, I
can
mean you
go
could
into
if
the
you want.
non-photorealistic, but I guess we're kind of already over an hour, so the
And-
NPR has to wait
yeah.
for another episode. This
I mean,
and
also,
whole
like,
universe to talk about.
Who says you can't make metallic donuts? You want to make metallic donuts? Make
Yeah,
Yeah,
metallic
sure.
donuts, right?
sci-fi
No, but
sci-fi
yeah.
materials
I
that
guess-
don't exist.
I guess in other words, it's like you gotta, like, you need, like, there's a lot of study involved, but then don't forget that you also got to trust in your instincts.
Yeah,
At
and I'm
some
thinking
point.
like it's kind of
Of
like these
balancing.
days that Yumi Hao mentioned, like when there were like the myths of the V-Ray community or whatever, the times where you had to like go deep into the settings, tweaking settings of this particular render engine. Like these are slowly kind of like there are still differences between render engines, but it's kind of like I'm seeing that there's this common ground appearing between softwares and also render engines, because the physics stay the same sort of. So like the whole PBR standard for texture creations and stuff, it kind of gives a common denominator for all the softwares. So it's getting like easier right now, I'm thinking. And also with live, the real-time render engines that appeared, and also the path tracers and all the other software is getting to the level of real-time preview. So it's really much easier nowadays to nail your shading than it was, I don't know, 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's a different like it changed. It's not only about speeding up the process, the way you start to work in a different way when you have some real life preview than when you have to learn run 20 tests, and it takes you like 30 minutes or whatever. You start to think differently, like more play around, more intuitively. You start to work more intuitively. And also one of the things that I remember was that actually there were two places, but maybe I will talk about it maybe when we talk about non-photorealistic rendering. But there should, you should have some kind of reserved trust to the render engine ability to create to mimic the real world, because of course they are very good at it, but it doesn't mean by definition that they are working exactly the same as the real world physics. And I remember one thing when there was some discussion about using the V-Ray camera, and somebody said, well, you shouldn't change the settings, the strength of the sun, of the V-Ray sun, to get a different exposure, because in reality you don't, right? You change the camera settings. And I thought that in this particular case, it was a correct thinking. Like, don't set the sun 10 times stronger to just get better exposure. Just keep it the same way, and just change the settings of the camera. But there was an assumption there that V-Ray at this particular moment of development was actually mimicking the behavior of the sun and the camera and the exposure and the shutter speed exactly in the same way in every place, in every part, in even extreme situations, completely photorealistic, which it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't mean just I don't mean that they couldn't or they make mistakes, but I mean, like, maybe they didn't even care to do that. So why do you so much assume that this is going to be photorealistic and physically correct? Especially that if you would go back to the, if you got, let's say, back in the time when you would buy a film for your camera, like Kodak film, Fuji, whatever, it has this information on in which parts of the exposition it behaves linearly, that it gets two times more light, and it gets exposed 2 times more. And it was only like some kind of part of the lighting conditions where it would behave like that. When it was too dark, it was irregular. When it was too light, it was again irregular. So this guy, maybe, I don't know if he knew that films would behave like that, and if he knew that, would he assume that V-Ray is exactly behaving the same? When you, let's say, actually choose Fuji, I don't know, Kodak, there were some profiles you could check. I don't think they covered that in V-Ray and in these settings. So this is not. And also I noticed another thing: when you make a picture of a glass, it always it is a real glass. It is a glass with that given IOR value, and you would always get more detail and fine reflections than just rendering the glass with this kind of IOR in any engine. That just render engines, in my opinion, when it comes to the reflection, for example, are making much more crude, and reality is much more delicate, and you get much more like this very fine detail in reflections than you get in 3D rendering. So for example, that's not really fitting together. You need to work on this to get this effect. So yeah, so this is good to, I think, to know that, to be aware that this is not like perfect physical world simulator. It's not the render engine.
Yeah, it's important to remember. Yeah,
ultimate, like whatever you do. I remember when I started play with 3D, and it was many years ago, because I had a very long break from doing that. I was in high school, I think, so it was in 90s, and I had like 3D. I had 3ds 3D Studio. It was not called Max yet, and there was only this scanline render, and I went into that, and I was really, I liked the fact that it's simulating reality. And I remember I got discouraged and I stopped doing that because I was doing like more and more experiments, and I wanted to do like the interior of a church of a cathedral, and I made this colorful glass, like this mosaic of the colorful glass on the window.
Stained glass.
Yes, stained glass. And I put the light through it, and I thought that this is going to give me colorful light on the floor, and it didn't, because it didn't have this colorful refraction feature back then. And I thought, oh, okay, so that's it. So this is not really simulating reality. It's not like this stuff. And I was kind of discouraged by that.
Lie.
Yeah. But now the render engines are much better at it, but that doesn't mean that they finally will cover everything completely and in the same proportions and detail as the real photo or your eye. It's especially when it comes to reflections, they are very often like very restricted.
Yeah, or acoustics.
I don't know. I'm not really caustics user.
But anyway, I think that's why it's also very important to. I mean, I think this would be useful. Again, like maybe not the same if like it's a product. If you're like rendering a product in a studio, but let's say even if you were trying to render like a photorealistic exterior, or like an exterior scene or anything, like as an example, like it's also important to remember to think about all of these things. Like sometimes nailing shading, it isn't a standalone thing. Also, it like you'll nail your shading within the context of the scene that you're going to use it for, or the scenes that you're going to use it for. And so sometimes it's like if like nailing shading also means like being able to create the illusion of something and like realizing that all you need is to be able to sell the illusion of something at some point. So if you were going to do like you were going to render an exterior, let's say, you might really pay attention to how like the surface characteristics of maybe the concrete or the wood of your structure, for example, are. But then further in the distance where there should be grass, maybe you end up creating. Maybe all it is just like a green color with a little translucency with like a pattern that kind of resembles grass from a distance that you used to drive displacement on it. And because it's so far away, you don't need to spend any more time on that. From that distance, it does look like grass. So like it's always remember that this is going to be in context of like your shaders will always serve the context of like where like what they're shading within a frame, where they are within a frame, unless of course you're shading for VR, which I think is a totally different conversation anyway, because I'm not sure that the rules apply exactly. But yeah, so I don't know. I think we can call it at this point. Or
Yeah,
anything?
I think we nailed it. Or if we didn't,
there are some little like maybe sideways still to cover, like I'm thinking, but I think the general stuff, we covered the general idea of it.
Yeah, if you guys listening to that have some golden tips that we missed out on, just share it in the comments. Or
and you know what, if you are using Corona or V-Ray, you can actually download our for example free assets from 3DB, and you can check how they are set, how the material settings look like, the shaders. And you can learn like actually I was learning that a lot from some Evermotion models back then, And
Yeah. So that's a good tip to analyze how other artists build up their shaders. Best way to learn, probably.
Yeah. So guys, hear you next week. We'll have a cool topic for sure.
Yeah. Stay
Yeah.
shady.
And keep on rendering out those shaders.
Yeah. Bye guys.
Okay, see ya.